Have you ever wondered what drives someone to risk everything for a single moment that could either set them free or destroy their entire life? Well, in 1987, a private jet disappeared from Miami International Airport along with $5.3 million in cash. And what happened next became one of the most puzzling unsolved cases in aviation history. But this wasn't just another missing aircraft story. This was the beginning of a decades-long mystery that would eventually expose a criminal network spanning multiple continents and reveal just how far someone will go when they're backed into a corner with nowhere left to run. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Miami International Airport as 34-year-old Elijah Carter methodically conducted his pre-flight inspection. The sleek Cessna Citation gleamed under the Florida sun, its polished surface reflecting the bustling activity of one of the nation's busiest aviation hubs. To any casual observer, Elijah appeared to be going through the motions of another routine charter flight. But appearances can be deceiving in ways that would haunt investigators for the next quarter century. Elijah had built his reputation as a pilot who never cut corners. With over 8,000 flight hours logged without a single incident, he was the kind of aviator that executive air services relied upon for their most sensitive operations. His colleagues described him as methodical, professional, and unflappable under pressure. He possessed the rare combination of technical expertise and discretion that made him invaluable in the world of private aviation, where clients often valued privacy above all else. Executive Air Services had carved out a lucrative niche in the charter industry by specializing in discreet transportation for high-profile clients throughout the Caribbean and South America. The company's fleet of well-maintained aircraft and carefully vetted pilots had earned them a reputation that commanded premium rates and attracted clientele who preferred not to ask too many questions about the nature of their business relationships. It was exactly the kind of operation that thrived in Miami during the 1980s, when the city served as a crossroads for legitimate commerce and less legitimate enterprises. Before we dive deeper into what happened that September morning, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The events that would culminate in one of aviation's most perplexing mysteries had been building for months before that fateful Tuesday in September. Executive Air Services frequently handled cargo flights for various clients, many of whom operated in the gray areas between legitimate business and activities that attracted unwanted government attention. The company had built its entire business model on two fundamental principles: reliability and absolute discretion. These qualities made them particularly attractive to individuals who needed to move sensitive materials without the scrutiny that came with commercial airlines or traditional freight services. The assignment that would change everything arrived on Elijah's desk 3 days before the incident. On the surface, it appeared to be nothing more than another routine cargo run. A client had requested transportation of what were described as sensitive documents and financial materials from Miami to a private airstrip in the Bahamas. The cargo manifest listed the contents as legal documents and business records with a declared value of $50,000, well within the normal range for the types of shipments Executive Air Services handled regularly. Standard operating procedure required all high-value cargo to be secured in the aircraft's locked compartment during transport. However, this particular client had made a specific request that the materials remain accessible during the flight, ostensibly for potential review and verification by their representative. While unusual, such requests weren't unheard of in the charter business, especially when dealing with time-sensitive legal or financial documents that might require last-minute modifications or additions. What Elijah couldn't have known at the time was that those seemingly innocent aluminum cases contained something far more valuable and dangerous than any collection of business documents. Federal investigators would later determine that the cargo consisted of meticulously bundled cash totaling $5.3 million. This money represented the accumulated proceeds from a sophisticated financial operation that had been systematically skimming funds from a series of real estate transactions throughout South Florida. The money laundering scheme had been operating for over 2 years, with funds being moved through an intricate network of shell companies and legitimate businesses before being prepared for transport out of the United States. The operation demonstrated a level of sophistication that suggested the involvement of individuals with extensive knowledge of both financial systems and international banking regulations. Every transaction had been carefully structured to avoid triggering the automatic reporting requirements that might attract federal attention. The morning of September 15, 1987, began with the kind of humid heat that characterized South Florida's late summer weather. Elijah arrived at the Executive Air Services hangar at 6:30 in the morning, nearly an hour before his scheduled departure time. This early arrival was typical of his methodical approach to flight preparation, but surveillance footage from that morning would later reveal subtle signs that this was anything but a routine day. Security cameras captured Elijah entering the building alone, his movements deliberate, but somehow different from his usual confident stride. He spent an unusually long time reviewing paperwork at his desk, occasionally glancing toward the window that overlooked the aircraft parking area. Most significantly, he made several phone calls during this period, including one conversation that lasted nearly 15 minutes. Phone records from that time period were later found to be incomplete due to a system upgrade that occurred shortly after the incident, leaving investigators with tantalizing gaps in their understanding of Elijah's final communications. At 7:45 in the morning, a black sedan with tinted windows pulled up to the private aviation terminal's cargo loading area. 3 men emerged from the vehicle, all dressed in conservative business attire that wouldn't have looked out of place in any corporate office building. 2 of the men appeared to be handling the logistics of transferring several aluminum cases from the vehicle to a wheeled cargo cart, while the third individual supervised the operation with the kind of attention to detail that suggested significant personal investment in the process. The cases were substantial in both size and apparent weight, requiring 2 people to safely lift each one from the sedan's trunk. Ground crew members who witnessed the loading process later testified that while the cases appeared heavy, this wasn't particularly unusual for document shipments, which often contained extensive files, bound materials, and reference documents that could easily account for the substantial weight. The transfer of cargo to the aircraft proceeded under Elijah's direct supervision, with each case being carefully secured in the citation's cabin area rather than the external cargo compartment. This arrangement, while somewhat unusual, was consistent with the client's request for accessible storage during the flight. Once the loading was complete, all 3 men from the sedan departed the area without boarding the aircraft, leaving Elijah to complete his final pre-flight preparations alone. The flight plan filed with air traffic control indicated a direct route to Nassau International Airport in the Bahamas, with an estimated flight time of 1 hour and 20 minutes. Weather conditions were ideal for the journey, with clear skies, excellent visibility, and minimal wind that would allow for a smooth flight across the Florida Straits. The citation had been fueled not just for the planned journey, but with additional reserves, following standard practice for international flights over water, where alternate landing options might be limited. Elijah's pre-flight inspection of the aircraft was thorough and methodical, exactly what ground crew had come to expect from one of Executive Air Service's most experienced pilots. He checked the aircraft's exterior for any signs of damage or wear, examined fuel levels and quality, tested control surfaces, and verified that all systems were functioning within normal parameters. To anyone observing his routine that morning, Elijah appeared to be preparing for just another charter flight to the Caribbean. At 8:37 in the morning, Elijah received clearance for takeoff from Miami International Airport's air traffic control tower. Radio communications during the departure phase were entirely routine and professional, with Elijah acknowledging instructions and reporting his aircraft's status in the calm, measured tones that characterized experienced aviators. The Citation departed on schedule and proceeded southeast toward Bahamian airspace, climbing to its assigned cruising altitude as it left the bustling airspace around Miami. For the first 43 minutes of the flight, everything proceeded exactly as planned. Elijah maintained regular contact with air traffic control, providing position reports at designated waypoints and indicating that all aircraft systems were operating normally. His voice over the radio remained steady and professional, giving no indication of mechanical issues, weather concerns, or any other factors that might complicate the flight. The flight path took the Citation over the crystal-clear waters of the Florida Straits, where the transition from the shallow turquoise waters near the coast to the deeper blue of the open ocean marked the boundary between United States and international airspace. This was familiar territory for Elijah, who had flown this route dozens of times during his tenure with Executive Air Services. The landmarks below would have been as familiar to him as the streets of his own neighborhood. Then, at 9:21 in the morning, something changed dramatically. Elijah's voice came over the radio with a transmission that would puzzle investigators and aviation experts for decades to come. He reported what he described as a minor electrical issue that was affecting some of the aircraft's navigation systems. While not immediately dangerous, he explained, the problem was significant enough to warrant a precautionary landing for inspection and potential repair before continuing to his destination. The transmission was delivered in Elijah's characteristic calm and professional manner, giving no indication of stress, panic, or immediate danger. He requested permission to deviate from his planned route to make a precautionary landing at a small airstrip on Cat Island, located approximately 60 miles northeast of his original Nassau destination. Air traffic control, following standard procedures for such requests, approved the deviation and provided Elijah with updated routing information to reach the alternate landing site. Cat Island's airstrip was little more than a grass runway carved out of the island's interior, used occasionally by local charter flights, private aircraft, and the occasional cargo plane serving the small community. The facility had no control tower, no ground services beyond basic fuel availability, and no security cameras or other monitoring equipment. It was exactly the kind of remote location where a pilot could land, inspect his aircraft, and continue his journey without attracting attention or generating paperwork. What happened during the next 12 minutes would become the subject of intense speculation, investigation, and theory among federal agents, aviation experts, and amateur sleuths. Radar contact with the Citation was lost at 9:33 in the morning as the aircraft descended below the coverage area of ground-based tracking systems. This loss of radar contact was not unusual for flights in that region, where the curvature of the Earth and the limitations of radar technology created blind spots, particularly for aircraft flying at lower altitudes near remote islands. The Citation never arrived at Cat Island's airstrip. More significantly, when Bahamian authorities later investigated the claimed electrical emergency, they found no record of any aircraft landing at the facility on September 15th. The grass runway showed no signs of recent aircraft activity, and the handful of local residents who lived near the airstrip reported seeing no unusual aviation activity that day. Back at Nassau International Airport, the Citation's failure to arrive at its scheduled time initially caused only mild concern. Delays were common in charter aviation, particularly when aircraft encountered mechanical issues or adverse weather conditions. However, as the morning stretched into afternoon without any communication from Elijah or confirmation of the aircraft's safe arrival anywhere in the Bahamas, concern escalated into alarm. By late afternoon, search and rescue operations were initiated across a wide area encompassing the planned flight route, the reported deviation toward Cat Island, and the surrounding waters where the aircraft might have crashed if the electrical problems had proven more serious than initially reported. The search effort involved multiple agencies from both the United States and the Bahamas, with Coast Guard aircraft and vessels methodically scouring hundreds of square miles of ocean, while ground teams checked every airstrip, beach, and potential landing area throughout the Bahamian island chain. Despite the extensive and well-coordinated search effort, no trace of the missing citation was found. There were no debris fields floating on the ocean surface, no emergency locator beacon signals, no witnesses reporting unusual aircraft activity, and no distress calls received by any monitoring stations. The aircraft had simply vanished as completely as if it had never existed, leaving behind only questions and the growing realization that something far more complex than a simple mechanical emergency had occurred. Meanwhile, investigators in Miami began examining the circumstances surrounding the flight with increasing scrutiny. The discovery that the cargo manifest had been falsified sent shockwaves through the investigation and transformed what might have been treated as a tragic aviation accident into a federal criminal case. When agents opened the aluminum cases that should have contained the citation, they instead found carefully organized documentation of the money laundering operation that had generated the missing $5.3 million. The documentation recovered from the Guatemalan site painted a picture of an operation that had operated with military-like precision for over 2 decades. Ledgers found in waterproof containers revealed a sophisticated accounting system that tracked not just financial transactions, but also personnel movements, aircraft maintenance schedules, and what appeared to be a complex network of safe houses and secondary facilities throughout Central America. The meticulous record-keeping suggested an organization with resources and expertise that extended far beyond simple money laundering. Among the most disturbing discoveries were detailed profiles of pilots who had worked for the operation. These files contained personal information, photographs, family details, and what investigators interpreted as leverage points that could be used to ensure cooperation. Elijah Carter's name appeared in these records, along with information about his divorce proceedings, his mother's medical condition, and his mounting financial difficulties. The files suggested that he had been under surveillance for months before being approached to participate in the operation. The psychological profile attached to Elijah's file was particularly chilling in its clinical assessment of his vulnerabilities. It described him as a highly skilled professional facing personal crisis, with strong moral principles that could be overcome through a combination of financial pressure and family-based threats. The document suggested that his recruitment had been carefully planned and executed over an extended period, rather than being a spontaneous decision on his part. Federal agents working the case discovered that the operation had employed a sophisticated recruitment strategy targeting aviation professionals throughout the southeastern United States. Pilots, mechanics, and air traffic controllers had all been identified and approached using similar methods. Many had declined to participate, but those who agreed found themselves increasingly entangled in a web of criminal activity that became impossible to escape without severe consequences. The facility's communication equipment provided additional insights into the operation's scope. Radio transcripts recovered from the site revealed regular contact between the Guatemalan base and similar facilities in Colombia, Panama, and Venezuela. The communications used coded language and frequently referenced shipments, personnel transfers, and what appeared to be coordination with corrupt officials at various international airports. One particularly significant discovery was evidence of the operation's connection to legitimate businesses throughout the region. Corporate records found at the site showed that the organization had established front companies in multiple countries, creating a network of apparently legal enterprises that facilitated the movement of both assets and personnel. These businesses ranged from import-export companies to tourism agencies, all carefully crafted to provide plausible explanations for the frequent movement of aircraft and personnel. The investigation into these front companies revealed a level of sophistication that impressed even experienced federal investigators. Each business had been established with legitimate documentation, proper licensing, and sufficient operational activity to avoid suspicion from local authorities. The companies maintained real employees, conducted actual business transactions, and paid appropriate taxes, all while serving as cover for the underlying criminal enterprise. Financial analysis of the recovered records suggested that the organization had moved over $200 million through its network during its operational period. The money had originated from sources including drug trafficking, arms dealing, political corruption, and various forms of financial fraud. The Guatemalan facility appeared to have served as a central processing point, where assets from multiple criminal enterprises were consolidated, converted, and redistributed to their ultimate destinations. The discovery of the site also shed new light on the broader context of criminal aviation during the 1980s and 1990s. Investigators realized that what they had initially viewed as an isolated incident involving a single pilot and a relatively modest sum of money was actually part of a much larger phenomenon. Private aviation had been systematically exploited by criminal organizations seeking to move assets and personnel beyond the reach of traditional law enforcement methods. The sophistication of the operation extended to its security measures and contingency planning. Documents found at the site revealed detailed protocols for dealing with law enforcement pressure, including procedures for rapidly evacuating facilities and destroying evidence. The organization had maintained multiple backup sites and had developed elaborate plans for relocating operations if any single facility became compromised. Perhaps most disturbing was evidence suggesting that the organization had infiltrated various government agencies and law enforcement departments throughout the region. Personnel files contained detailed information about corrupt officials who had provided protection, intelligence, and logistical support to the operation. The network of corruption extended from local airport security personnel to high-ranking government officials in multiple countries. The fate of Elijah Carter remained unclear despite the wealth of information recovered from the Guatemalan site. While his aircraft had been found at the facility, there was no definitive evidence of what had happened to him after his arrival. Human remains, discovered at various locations around the airstrip, could not be definitively identified, leaving investigators to speculate about his ultimate fate. Some evidence suggested that pilots who successfully completed their initial assignments were offered opportunities to remain with the organization in various capacities. Personnel records indicated that several aviators had transitioned from one-time contractors to full-time employees of the criminal network. These individuals received new identities, relocated to safe locations, and continued working for the organization under assumed names. However, other evidence painted a more sinister picture of the organization's treatment of its personnel. Medical records found at the site documented various injuries and illnesses among workers, some of which appeared consistent with violence or coercion. The remote location of the facility and the presence of armed security personnel suggested that leaving the operation once involved might not have been a simple matter of personal choice. The investigation into the Guatemalan facility continued for several years after its initial discovery. International cooperation between law enforcement agencies in multiple countries led to the identification and arrest of dozens of individuals connected to the network. However, many key figures had disappeared years earlier, apparently warned of the impending collapse of their operation by sources within various government agencies. The case also revealed the limitations of international law enforcement cooperation during the period when the operation was active. Jurisdictional disputes, political corruption, and limited communication between agencies had created an environment where sophisticated criminal organizations could operate with relative impunity across international borders. The discovery served as a catalyst for improved cooperation and information sharing between law enforcement agencies throughout the region. For the families of missing pilots and other personnel who had disappeared while working for similar operations, the discovery provided both hope and anguish. While it confirmed that their loved ones had likely been involved in criminal activity, it also suggested that many had been coerced or manipulated into participation rather than acting as willing criminals. The broader implications of the case extended far beyond the specific circumstances of Elijah Carter's disappearance. It revealed the existence of a shadow aviation industry that had operated parallel to legitimate charter services, exploiting the same infrastructure and personnel while serving dramatically different purposes. The discovery forced aviation authorities to reassess their security procedures and oversight mechanisms to prevent similar exploitation in the future. As investigators continued to analyze the massive volume of evidence recovered from the Guatemalan site, new connections emerged linking the operation to various unsolved cases throughout the Americas. Missing aircraft, unexplained financial transactions, and the disappearances of aviation personnel began to form patterns that suggested the existence of multiple similar networks operating during the same period. The case of the missing citation and its $5.3 million cargo had evolved from a single incident into a window into an entire criminal ecosystem that had thrived for decades while remaining largely invisible to law enforcement. The discovery in Guatemala marked not the end of the investigation, but rather the beginning of a much larger effort to understand and dismantle the networks that had made such operations possible. The revelation that the Guatemalan facility had been operational for decades fundamentally altered investigators' understanding of the case. What had begun as an inquiry into a single missing aircraft and its pilot evolved into an examination of an entire shadow aviation network that had operated with impunity throughout the Cold War era and beyond. The scope of evidence recovered from the site suggested that the operation had served multiple criminal enterprises simultaneously, providing transportation services for everything from money laundering to arms trafficking. Federal agents working with international partners began the painstaking process of analyzing thousands of documents recovered from the facility. Many had suffered significant water damage and insect infestation during their years in the tropical environment, but forensic specialists were able to reconstruct enough information to piece together a clearer picture of the operation's structure and methodology. The documentation revealed a level of operational security that would have impressed military intelligence services, with coded communications, compartmentalized information, and elaborate procedures for maintaining operational secrecy. The financial records alone painted a staggering picture of criminal enterprise. Conservative estimates suggested that over $500 million had passed through the facility during its operational period, representing proceeds from criminal activities spanning multiple continents. The money had originated from sources as diverse as Colombian drug cartels, corrupt government officials throughout Central America, arms dealers operating in conflict zones, and sophisticated financial fraud schemes targeting major corporations and financial institutions. What made the operation particularly effective was its integration with legitimate business enterprises. The facility had been established under the cover of an agricultural development company, complete with proper permits, tax payments, and a small but genuine farming operation that provided cover for the extensive aviation activities. Local officials had been systematically corrupted through a combination of bribes, intimidation, and the provision of economic opportunities for their communities. The operation had become so embedded in the local economy that its sudden abandonment had caused significant economic disruption for surrounding villages. The aircraft maintenance records found at the site revealed the technical sophistication of the operation. Multiple mechanics and avionics specialists had been employed full-time to maintain a fleet of aircraft in airworthy condition, despite the remote location and challenging environmental conditions. Parts and supplies had been smuggled in through various channels, including legitimate aviation suppliers who believed they were supporting agricultural and medical transport operations in underserved regions. Personal files discovered in the ruins of the administrative buildings provided disturbing insights into how the operation recruited and controlled its personnel. The organization had maintained detailed psychological profiles of potential recruits, identifying individuals who could be coerced into cooperation through financial pressure, family threats, or legal vulnerabilities. Many recruits had been approached during personal crises, when their judgment might be compromised and their options limited. Elijah Carter's file, found in a waterproof container buried beneath the collapsed administrative building, contained information that federal investigators had never uncovered during their original investigation. The file indicated that he had been under surveillance for nearly 8 months before being approached for recruitment. Operatives had documented his financial difficulties, his mother's medical condition, his marital problems, and even his daily routines with disturbing precision. The recruitment strategy had been carefully planned to exploit his vulnerabilities while providing him with what appeared to be a legitimate solution to his mounting problems. The file also contained photographs that had been taken without Elijah's knowledge, showing him at his apartment, at work, visiting his mother in the hospital, and meeting with divorce attorneys. The level of surveillance suggested a well-funded operation with access to professional intelligence gathering resources. More disturbing were handwritten notes indicating that threats had been made against his mother's safety if he failed to cooperate with the organization's requirements. Evidence suggested that the recruitment process had begun with what appeared to be a routine charter assignment. Elijah had been selected for several legitimate flights to Caribbean destinations, allowing his handlers to assess his skills, discretion, and psychological state. These preliminary assignments had been used to build trust and establish a working relationship before more sensitive operations were proposed. The progression from legitimate charter work to criminal transportation had been gradual and carefully managed. The facility's communication center, though heavily damaged by years of neglect and deliberate destruction, yielded crucial information about the operation's international connections. Radio equipment, capable of long-range communication, had been used to coordinate activities across multiple countries. Frequency logs showed regular contact with similar facilities in Colombia, Panama, Venezuela, and several Caribbean nations. The communications had used sophisticated coding systems that required extensive analysis by cryptographic specialists to decode. Intercepted communications revealed that the operation had maintained active intelligence networks within various government agencies throughout the region. Corrupt officials in customs services, aviation authorities, and law enforcement agencies had provided advance warning of investigations, facilitated document forgeries, and ensured that sensitive cargo could move through the official checkpoints without scrutiny. The corruption network had extended to surprisingly high levels within several governments, including individuals with access to classified information about international law enforcement operations. The discovery of the facility also provided new insights into the broader context of Cold War-era criminal aviation. Documents found at the site indicated that the operation had sometimes provided services to intelligence agencies from various countries, creating a complex web of relationships that blurred the lines between criminal enterprise and state-sponsored activities. Some flights had carried legitimate intelligence personnel and materials, while others had transported criminal assets and fugitives. This dual-use model had provided additional protection from law enforcement while generating substantial profits from multiple sources. Medical records found in the facility's infirmary revealed disturbing information about the treatment of personnel who had attempted to leave the operation or had become security risks. Several individuals had been detained at the facility for extended periods, ostensibly for medical treatment but actually to prevent them from compromising operational security. The records suggested that some personnel had been held against their will, treated with powerful sedatives, and subjected to various forms of psychological manipulation designed to ensure their continued cooperation. The fate of Elijah Carter became somewhat clearer through the analysis of these medical records and other personnel files. Evidence suggested that he had remained at the facility for several months after his initial arrival, during which time he had been used for additional flights throughout the region. However, his psychological profile indicated increasing instability and growing awareness of the operation's criminal nature. Notes in his medical file suggested that he had been experiencing severe anxiety and had made several attempts to communicate with family members in the United States. A particularly disturbing entry in the medical records, dated approximately 6 months after Elijah's disappearance from Miami, indicated that he had suffered what was described as a severe psychological breakdown. The entry noted that he had become increasingly paranoid and had threatened to expose the operation unless he was allowed to return to the United States. This threat had apparently been taken seriously by the facility's security personnel, as subsequent entries described various measures taken to prevent him from carrying out his threats. The story of Elijah Carter and the vanished citation serves as a haunting reminder that, beneath the surface of routine operations, elaborate criminal networks can flourish for decades without detection. The discovery of that remote Guatemalan facility 25 years later transformed what appeared to be a single act of desperation into evidence of a sophisticated international operation that had exploited the vulnerabilities of countless individuals facing personal crises. While we may never know definitively whether Elijah was a willing participant or an unwitting victim caught in circumstances beyond his control, his story reveals how quickly ordinary lives can intersect with extraordinary criminal enterprises, leaving behind mysteries that span continents and decades.